My grandmother's ring was supposed to be exactly where it had always been, in the small wooden box at the back of my mother's dresser, wrapped in a faded cloth, taken out only on special occasions, always with the same quiet care, like touching something fragile and sacred at the same time. When I opened the box, it was empty. At first, I thought I was mistaken. I checked again, moving aside old receipts and tangled necklaces that hadn't been worn in years. I even looked under the dresser, as if the ring could have slipped away on its own. It hadn't. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with money or value. This wasn't panic. It was recognition. Something was wrong. I walked into the kitchen where my mother was standing at the counter, sorting mail. She didn't look up when I asked, "Where's Grandma's ring?" Her hands paused, just for a second. Then she said, casually, "Oh, I sold it." The words didn't land all at once. They arrived slowly, like they needed time to be understood. "You, what?" I asked. She sighed, already tired of the conversation she clearly didn't want to have. "I had to. I used the money to pay off my credit card. The late fees were getting out of control." I stared at her, waiting for the rest, for the part where she said she was joking, or that she meant she had pawned it temporarily, or that she had talked to me first. None of that came. "You didn't tell me," I said. She shrugged. "I didn't think I needed to. It was just sitting there. Just sitting there." That ring wasn't just anything. It was the last thing my grandmother had given me before she passed away. The only piece of her I could touch. She had pressed it into my hand years ago and whispered that one day it would be mine. My mother knew that. She had been standing right there when my grandmother said it. I tried to keep my voice steady. "That ring wasn't yours to sell." My mother finally turned to look at me. "I'm her daughter," she said, "and I needed the money. Jewelry can be replaced. A missed payment can't." There it was, a decision already justified, a line already drawn. I realized then that this wasn't about debt, or stress, or bad timing. It was about who believed they had the right to decide what mattered, and who didn't. And in that moment, something far more valuable than a ring had already been lost. My grandmother never wore much jewelry. She owned that ring and a simple watch she stopped winding years before she passed. The ring wasn't large or flashy. It didn't sparkle in a way that made people notice it across a room. But it had weight to it, not because of the gold, but because of the years it had lived through. I remembered sitting beside her as a child, watching her hands while she talked. She spoke slowly, carefully, like every word mattered. The ring was always there, catching the light when she moved. A quiet constant in a life that had never been easy. She had survived things my mother and I only knew about through fragments. A war she never described in detail. Years of scarcity she joked about but never forgot. She used to say the ring was the one thing she bought for herself when she finally had the money to do it, not to show off. Just to mark a moment when life stopped taking from her. When she got sick, she stopped wearing it. One afternoon, when it was just the two of us in her room, she reached into her drawer and placed the ring in my palm. Her hand trembled slightly as she closed my fingers around it. "This stays in the family," she said. "And one day, it stays with you." I didn't think of it as ownership back then. I thought of it as trust. After she passed, the ring stayed in my mother's dresser, exactly where my grandmother had kept it. We never argued about it. We never needed to. The understanding was quiet and shared, or so I thought. Every time I visited, I would sometimes ask to see it. My mother would open the drawer, lift the cloth, and let me hold it for a moment. She knew what it meant to me. She saw the way my expression softened every time, like touching that ring brought my grandmother back into the room for a few seconds. That's why her words in the kitchen hurt more than I expected. It was just sitting there. To her, the ring had become idle, unused, a resource waiting to be converted into something more practical. To me, it had never stopped working. It wasn't meant to be worn daily or shown off. It was meant to exist, to be there when I needed to remember who my grandmother was and who I was to her. When my mother talked about interest rates and late fees, I listened. But my mind kept drifting back to that moment in my grandmother's room, the promise she had made, the way she trusted that her wishes would be respected without needing to be written down. That trust had been broken without a second thought. What made it worse wasn't just that the ring was gone, it was that the decision had been made without me. No conversation, no warning, no acknowledgement that this object carried a meaning that couldn't be measured against a credit card statement. My mother spoke as if practicality erased sentiment, as if responsibility automatically justified everything else. But responsibility, I realized, should also include protecting what can't be replaced. You can pay off debt in 100 different ways. You can negotiate with banks. You can ask for extensions. You can even rebuild credit after it's damaged. You can't rebuild a promise made by someone who is no longer alive. Standing there, listening to her explain why she had done it, I understood something uncomfortable. My mother hadn't acted out of desperation alone. She had acted out of entitlement. A belief that because she was the daughter, she could override my grandmother's wishes without consequence. She hadn't just sold a ring. She had decided that memory was negotiable. And once that line was crossed, it didn't matter how calm her voice was or how logical her explanation sounded. Something fundamental between us had shifted. The ring had connected 3 generations of women, quietly, patiently. And now, without asking, that connection had been severed. My mother didn't see herself as someone who had done anything wrong. That became clear the longer she talked. She didn't raise her voice or grow defensive in the way people do when they know they've crossed a line. Instead, she explained her decision the way someone explains a necessary chore, unpleasant, but unavoidable. Her credit cards were maxed out. The interest rates had climbed higher than she expected. Every month, a late payment fee stacked on top of the balance, turning a manageable problem into something that felt urgent and out of control. I was drowning, she said. I had to do something. I didn't doubt that part. My mother had always struggled with money, not because she didn't earn enough, but because stress made her impulsive, and impulsive choices created cycles she never quite escaped. What I doubted was the conclusion she had drawn. Of all the options available to her, calling the bank, asking for a hardship plan, even coming to me, she had chosen the one that required no conversation and no accountability. She sold the ring because it was easy. It was already there, already valuable, already quiet. It wouldn't argue back or ask questions. It wouldn't remind her that she was touching something that didn't belong to her alone. She told me she had gone to a local jeweler she'd passed 100 times without noticing. She described the transaction casually, the way people talk about errands. The man behind the counter weighed the ring, examined the setting, and named a price, without asking where it came from. She took the cash and paid her credit card bill the same afternoon. Just like that, the problem was solved. Listening to her talk, I realized she had framed the situation in her mind as a trade-off. Something tangible for something abstract. Gold for peace of mind. A ring for relief. What she refused to acknowledge was what she had traded away on my behalf. When I asked her why she hadn't told me first, she looked genuinely confused. I didn't think you'd say yes, she admitted. And that didn't stop you? I asked. She hesitated. I knew you'd be emotional about it. There it was. Emotion, to her, was an obstacle. Something to work around instead of something to respect. By not telling me, she had spared herself discomfort. She had protected her own sense of urgency at the cost of my trust. She said the late payment penalty would have made things worse, that credit damage followed you for years, that she didn't want collectors calling. Jewelry can be replaced, she repeated, like it was a fact that ended the conversation. I wanted to ask her if she would have sold something of mine without permission, if it had been less sentimental, if she would have crossed the same line for something that didn't come from her mother. But I already knew the answer. This wasn't about desperation alone. It was about control. About believing that practical needs gave her the right to make unilateral decisions over shared history. As she spoke, I felt myself pulling back. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. I understood now that my mother saw family heirlooms as assets first and memories second. That realization hurt more than the loss of the ring itself, because it meant that even if the ring could somehow be found and bought back, something else had already been spent. Trust. And unlike credit card debt, that doesn't disappear once the balance hits zero. The more my mother talked, the clearer it became that she believed this conversation was about reassurance, not accountability. She wasn't waiting for forgiveness. She was waiting for understanding. Her version of it, at least. The kind where I nodded, sighed, and accepted that circumstances had forced her hand. Even if I didn't like the outcome. She kept returning to the same argument, circling it from different angles, polishing it until it sounded reasonable enough to stand on its own. I didn't have a choice, she said. You know how bad my credit is. One more late payment and the interest would have jumped again. I listened. Not because I agreed, but because I needed to hear how far she would take it. You're young, she continued. You'll have time to build your own memories. Your grandmother lived her life. She wouldn't want me drowning in debt over a ring. That sentence landed harder than she expected. Because my grandmother would have wanted many things. She would have wanted honesty. She would have wanted her wishes respected. And she would never have wanted her legacy used as an emergency fund without a conversation. I said that out loud. My mother frowned, like I was being unfair. You're romanticizing it, she replied. At the end of the day, it's just an object. Just an object. That was the moment I realized we weren't speaking the same language. To her, value was measured in immediacy. What fixed the problem fastest? What stopped the bleeding? What made tomorrow easier than today? To me, value was measured in continuity, in what carried meaning forward, in what connected past to present without being reduced to a dollar amount. She accused me of prioritizing sentiment over responsibility. I accused her of prioritizing convenience over respect. Neither of us raised our voices, but the space between us felt louder than shouting. I asked her if she would have sold the ring if my grandmother had still been alive. She didn't answer right away. That's not the same, she said finally. It is, I replied. The only difference is that Grandma can't object anymore. Her silence confirmed what words wouldn't. I asked where she had sold it. She hesitated, then gave me the name of the jeweler. She spoke as if sharing the information was a compromise, a peace offering. I didn't thank her, because knowing where the ring went didn't undo the fact that she had decided its fate without me. She tried one last time to justify it. I needed to be practical, she said. Sometimes you have to choose what matters most in the moment. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and understood something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. She had chosen herself, not survival, not necessity, herself. She had chosen the fastest relief with the least resistance. She had chosen not to ask because asking would have meant accepting a possible no, and she had chosen to believe that my pain would fade faster than her debt would have. I didn't argue anymore after that. There was nothing left to explain. I told her quietly that selling the ring wasn't the worst part. The worst part was deciding I didn't deserve a say in something that had been promised to me. Her face softened then, but it was too late. Softness without accountability doesn't repair damage. It only tries to smooth over the edges. That night, as I left her house, I understood that something fundamental had changed. Not in how I felt about the ring, but in how I saw my mother. She wasn't careless. She was deliberate. And that meant the line she had crossed wasn't accidental. It was chosen. I didn't realize how deep the damage went until a few days later. It wasn't during the argument. It wasn't even the night I left her house. It happened quietly, when I reached for my phone to call my mother about something unrelated and stopped myself halfway through dialing. For the first time, I hesitated. That pause told me everything. The ring wasn't just gone. The assumption that some things were shared, protected, and respected had gone with it. What my mother crossed wasn't a financial line. It was a line of permission. She hadn't just made a bad decision. She had decided she didn't need my consent. Growing up, I had been taught that family meant shared history and mutual care, that some things belonged to all of us, even if they sat in one person's drawer. My grandmother's ring had lived in that space, physically with my mother, emotionally with me. By selling it, my mother had quietly rewritten that rule. When I tried to explain this to her later, she grew defensive again. She told me I was overreacting, that I was letting grief distort my judgment. She said I was acting as if she had stolen something from me. "You're my daughter," she said. "I wouldn't steal from you." But that was exactly what had happened. Not theft in the legal sense. Theft of trust. Theft of agency. Theft of the understanding that my feelings and my grandmother's wishes mattered enough to slow her down. I asked her if she would have done the same thing with something that belonged solely to me, my laptop, my savings, anything I had worked for myself. She didn't answer. Instead, she told me I was making the situation bigger than it needed to be. That was when I finally understood what the real boundary was. It wasn't about objects. It was about decision-making, about who believed they had the right to decide what could be sacrificed when pressure appeared. And in my mother's mind, my inheritance, emotional or otherwise, was negotiable. Once I saw that clearly, I stopped trying to make her feel guilty. Guilt could be explained away. Boundaries couldn't. I told her calmly that what hurt most was not losing the ring, but losing the assumption that she would protect what mattered to me when I couldn't protect it myself. She listened this time, really listened. But listening didn't turn into agreement. She said she wished I could understand how desperate she had felt. I said I wished she had trusted me enough to tell me before making the decision. Neither wish was granted. In the days that followed, I found myself pulling back in small, unannounced ways. I shared less. I visited less often. I stopped assuming my mother would automatically be included in parts of my life that required vulnerability. She noticed. She asked if I was upset, if I was holding a grudge, if I was punishing her. I told her the truth. "I'm protecting myself," I said, "because I now know what you're willing to justify." That conversation ended without resolution, not because it failed, but because it revealed something permanent. Trust, once broken this way, doesn't shatter loudly. It thins. It stretches. It becomes careful. I didn't stop loving my mother, but I stopped assuming she would always act in my best interest when stress entered the picture. That was the line she crossed. And once crossed, it didn't move back on its own. The weeks after the ring disappeared felt strangely hollow. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no explosive arguments, no long phone calls filled with shouting or tears. Instead, there was a quiet shift in how I moved through my relationship with my mother, and how she moved around me. She called less often. When she did call, her tone was careful, almost rehearsed, as if she were afraid of saying the wrong thing and reopening a wound she didn't know how to close. I answered politely, warmly, even, but something in me stayed guarded. That was new. Before this, I had always assumed distance meant conflict, that pulling back was a form of punishment or resentment. Now I understood it differently. Distance could be a boundary, not a weapon. My mother tried to compensate in practical ways. She offered to help with errands I hadn't asked for. She suggested cooking my favorite meals when I visited. She even mentioned, more than once, that she could start saving to buy a similar ring someday. A replacement. she called it. Each time she said it, I felt the same quiet ache. A replacement implied equivalence, as if what was lost could be recreated by finding something that looked close enough. She still didn't understand that the ring's value had never been in its appearance. It had been in its history, in the hands that had worn it, the promises attached to it, the moments it had silently witnessed. I didn't argue with her about it anymore. I had learned that repeating myself wouldn't change her perspective. Instead, I changed my behavior. I stopped leaving sentimental items at her house, photos, letters, small keepsakes. I kept them with me now. Not because I feared she would sell them, but because I no longer trusted her judgment under pressure. That realization hurt more than I expected. One afternoon, she asked me directly if I was still angry. I don't think so, I answered honestly. I'm just clearer. She looked confused. About what? About what I can and can't hand over to you, I said. About what needs my protection. She sat with that for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if accepting something she didn't fully agree with. The debt situation improved. The credit card balance was gone. The urgency that had driven her decision faded, replaced by relief. But that relief didn't undo the choice she had made. What lingered was the knowledge that when things became difficult, my mother had chosen speed over conversation, control over collaboration, certainty over care. I stopped assuming she would consult me before making decisions that affected both of us, and I stopped feeling guilty for that shift. There was one moment that stayed with me. A few weeks later, while sorting through old boxes, my mother found a scarf that had belonged to my grandmother. She held it up and asked, almost casually, if I wanted it. I said yes immediately. She handed it to me without comment. That small exchange carried more meaning than any apology. It showed me she was trying, in her own imperfect way, to recognize the boundary she had crossed. But trying didn't erase the lesson. I learned that love doesn't automatically protect what matters, intentions don't guarantee respect, and family history doesn't excuse unilateral decisions made at someone else's expense. The ring was gone. What remained was choice. The choice to redefine how much access someone has to your memories. The choice to stop assuming shared blood equals shared values. The choice to protect what can't be replaced, even if doing so feels uncomfortable at first. I hadn't lost my mother, but I had lost the version of our relationship that relied on unquestioned trust. And in its place, I built something quieter, more cautious, more honest. That was the aftermath. I never saw my grandmother's ring again. I don't know who bought it, or where it ended up. Maybe it sits in a jewelry box belonging to someone who admires its craftsmanship without knowing its history. Maybe it was melted down, its shape erased,